who was Luke? Who was this person who wrote 25% of the New Testament? It's the same person who wrote Luke and Acts, first of all. There are things that show you that, of which the most significant is the echo at the beginning of Acts from the beginning of Luke. In my first book, Theophilus, I wrote about all that Jesus began to do and teach, says the author of Acts. And the book of Acts echoes the dedication to Theophilus at the beginning of Luke's Gospel, where it's clear that it's the same person being addressed, and the Acts one echoes and says, and now I'm going to tell you the next part of the story. Interesting, isn't it, that Luke says, I talked about what Jesus began to do and teach. The implication is that the book of Acts is about what Jesus now continues to do and teach. So who is Luke? One of the key clues are a number of passages in Acts where Luke speaks of himself and puts himself in the story. He says, we did this. We went to this place. We went to that place. They start in Acts chapter 16, where Luke engages with Paul for the first time. And so we get in 16:11, we set sail from Troas and made a straight course to Samothrace, the following day to Neapolis, and so on. And dotted through the rest of Acts, we've got a number of these so-called we passages. So what's the author of Acts saying by including these passages? The most natural explanation is to say he's saying, I was there. He's drawing on his own experience and his own experience of travelling with Paul. Now, others have tried to suggest different explanations for those we passages. One of the most popular ones until recently was that this was a convention used in sea voyages. And the people who noticed this, notably a scholar called Vernon Robbins, noticed that when ancient sea voyages are described, they're often written in the first person plural. We did this, we went to that place, and so on. And a lot of the we passages in Acts are like that. However, there are two things to notice. The first is that in ancient stories, sea voyages aren't always written in the first person plural. A number of them are written in the third person. They did this, they did that, they did the other. And equally, large chunks of the we passages in Acts are not sea voyages. They're about things that happen on land. So it's too simple to say that they're just sea voyage passages. The simplest explanation is either that the author of Acts has got a diary from somebody who travels with Paul, or is somebody who travels with Paul himself. Here's the interesting thing. Luke's never named in the book of Acts. So if we're to work out who the we is, we need to eliminate from Acts the people who are named as Paul's travel companions. And as you slim that list down and down and down, Luke is the one name that emerges as a possibility. What else do we know about Luke? Well, in Colossians 4:14, we're told that Luke is the beloved physician. He's a doctor, a medical doctor, and that's been a factor that's played in that. In 2 Timothy, towards the end, again, Paul says, Luke is with me. And if this letter's genuine, then it's from very near the end of the life of Paul when he's probably in prison in Rome. So there you've got two clues from Paul's letters that there's someone called Luke who travels around with him. From the earliest days of the Christian church, the only name that's ever been attached to the gospel and to Acts is Luke. So it looks as though that's the person we're talking about. He travels around with Paul for part of the time, but not all of the time. Now, if that's the case, what does that imply about how he got his information? Clearly, the large part of Acts about Paul from chapter 13 onwards could come from either Luke's own experience of being there or Luke's conversations with Paul. What about the earlier parts of Acts? Well, there's a 2-year period when Paul is in prison in Caesarea. Caesarea is on the coast of Palestine, and there it's in the middle of one of these we passages. So when Luke is, when Paul's in prison there in Caesarea, Luke has the possibility of travelling around. And it's highly likely, if Luke is Paul's travelling companion, that he would have used the opportunity to do some of the research for his Gospel and his book of Acts then. It's very likely that he would have interviewed some of the earliest members of the Christian church and got information about the early days of the book of Acts. It's very likely he would have got the stories about Jesus' birth from members of his family, and the stories of his trip to Jerusalem that's in Luke 2 from members of his family. So if Luke is Paul's travelling companion, that 2-year period provides him with the most brilliant opportunity to do the research that allows him to draw the material together for his gospel. And it allows him to collect the stories in the book of Acts for the period when he's not around. Because as far as we can see, Luke comes from Antioch. He's a Gentile. He's come to a Christian faith not from a Jewish background. Although by the time he writes Luke and Acts, he knows the scriptures really, really well. There are not only quotations from scripture, but there are echoes of scripture and phrases that are biblical phrases that make it sound like the way somebody speaks who really knows his Bible. That's made some people wonder if Luke himself might be Jewish. But if Luke's become a Christian in somewhere in the 40s AD and is writing his book of Acts around 80, then he's been a Christian for quite a long time. He's got to know Scripture really well. And he can now draw on those years and years of experience to show how Scripture's being fulfilled in the things that he's writing. The picture of Paul in Acts is an issue that's been a real matter of debate among scholars. People have looked at the picture of Paul in Acts and said, well, this doesn't sound terribly like the picture of Paul that we get in the letters. So, for instance, they look at the picture in Acts 17, where Paul in Athens argues for the creation of the world as pointing to God for people, whereas in Romans chapter 1, he seems to read the creation of the world as pointing to God, but argues that people have rejected it. So can we fit these two together? Can we fit the pictures of Paul in Acts and the letters together? One really important clue is to ask what kind of Paul they're both portraying. In the letters of Paul, Paul is writing to people who are believers in Jesus. He's writing to them, engaging with the issues that are facing them. In Corinth, for instance, in 1 Corinthians, we know that he's replying to some issues in a letter. So that in chapter 7, verse 1, he says, now, about the matters you wrote to me about. And then every so often through the rest of the letter, you'll see the phrase now concerning or now about. And there he seems to be picking up issues that they've written to him about. That's very typical of Paul's letters. They are letters engaging with particular situations and trying to help Christian people think through and understand and live as Christians in their culture with the particular issues they're facing and the particular questions those situations are raising. Look at the picture of Paul in Acts and you get a very different picture. And that's because in Acts, we're mostly listening to Paul engaging with people who are not Christians. The speeches in Acts that Paul has are virtually all engaged with people who are not yet believers and trying to persuade them to become believers, such as the one in the synagogue in Antioch in chapter 13, or the one to the pagans of Acts 17 in Athens. The other type of speeches we get are judicial speeches, such as the ones in the later part of Acts, Acts 22, Acts 26, where Paul is defending himself before a court. Now, Paul being Paul, he's going to talk about Jesus. But the focus of the speech is speaking in a courtroom, is engaging with people in a courtroom to defend and explain his Christian faith. The only place in Acts we get close to the situation in the letters is in Acts chapter 20. And it's as though Acts 20 forms a bridge between the two parts of Paul's life. Up to Acts 20, we're looking at Paul the missionary, travelling around, speaking about Jesus, establishing Christian communities, getting them built up, appointing leaders for them, and moving on to the next place. From Acts 21 onwards, Paul is in Jerusalem and then he's a prisoner. Now, my goodness, this is Paul, so he's still a missionary. So think of Paul as the missionary prisoner. In Acts 20, we just get these little vignettes of Paul the pastor. We get Paul speaking to the Christian community at Troas and speaking so long that poor old Eutychus falls out the window and collapses, and Paul lays hands on him and raises him from the dead. He breaks bread with them and he continues speaking to them. Then he goes to Miletus, and in Miletus he calls the elders from the church at Ephesus to him. Miletus is just down the coast from Ephesus, so it's just a short hop by ship or a fairly short journey over land. So in Acts 20, verses 17 to 38, Paul engages with the elders from the church at Ephesus, and he talks to them about Christian leadership. And he brings to them teaching about Christian leadership, which is very, very interesting. He talks about the importance of faithfulness to what the gospel is about, and he says, this is what he's done. You've seen the way I did it, he says. He talks about the centrality of the death of Jesus. God purchased the church for himself through the blood of his own in Acts 20:32, which is a remarkable, 20:28, which is a remarkable statement about how Paul understands the death of Jesus. He talks about his own lifestyle in verses 33 to 35, where he says that he himself earned money, he worked with his own hands so that he could provide for his companions. And he commends all those ways of doing things to the elders of Ephesus. Now, if you look at 1 Thessalonians 2, 1 to 12, you find exactly the same themes come out. He talks about how hard he worked while he was in Thessalonica so that he wouldn't burden any of them. He talks about his care and love for them. He talks about the importance of the gospel message. So when you listen to Paul as a pastor in Acts, you find the same ideas, often using actually exactly the same language as you do in the Paul of the letters. It's not surprising that the rest of the time in Acts, Paul does sound rather different. If I was in a court of law defending myself, I would speak very differently to when I preach at church. If I'm talking with people who are not yet Christians about my faith, I'll speak to them differently to the way that I would speak in a home group in my church. It's hardly surprising that Paul sounds different. He's taking the same theology, the same understanding of God, the same ideas, but contextualizing them into particular settings and engaging with people in particular settings in that way. So it's not surprising, to take the example I began with, that he sounds different in Acts 17 compared to Romans 1. In Romans 1, he's talking to Christians and warning them about the dangers of the pagan world. A pagan world which recognizes God, has enough evidence to know there's a God there, but turns its back on him and prefers to worship creatures rather than the creator, is the phrase he uses. Prefers to set up idols made of wood or metal or stone and worship them rather than the one true God who made the world. He says exactly the same thing in Acts 17. It's mistaken, he says, to worship idols, because the one true God is the creator. And he created the world in the intricacy it is, in the way it is, so that people might seek and look for him. Now, the way he puts it is that he uses a Greek optative, which is a very, very tentative way of expressing something. The idea is that people would seek for him, seek for God, and might just possibly find him. It's very, very tentative. So the idea isn't that different to Romans 1. It's just Paul expressing himself differently to a not yet believing audience than to a believing audience. And that's where the major difference between the two comes. The other thing to notice is the simple observation that when you listen to somebody talking about themselves, you're not listening to an unbiased report. You're listening to that person as they envisage themselves, as they picture themselves. Now that's very different to the way someone else might see them. If Luke is Paul's travelling companion, as I think is likely, then yes, he'd know Paul well, but he might not see Paul the way Paul saw himself. Some of the things he'd say about Paul might be different to what Paul would say. Paul's often very critical of himself. Think of the way in Philippians he talks about what kind of person he was before he became a believer. He says that he was a person who persecuted the church, who did his best to destroy the church. And Paul isn't proud of that at all. And Luke reports that, but he's not as hard on Paul as Paul is on himself. So you're looking at portraits from different angles, and it's not a good idea when you're looking at a self-portrait to say, oh, that's the objective reality, compared to someone else's portrait of the person. Put the two together, try and match them up. And in the rare cases we've got in the ancient world where we've got two different perspectives on a person, ancient historians' approach to that is to say, can we put these two portraits together? Can we blend them? Can we harmonise them in a way that makes good sense of them? Rather than to say, oh, well, we've got two portraits, they can't both be right. How can we connect Acts with history? Luke is certainly aiming to write history. He begins his gospel in Luke 1:1-4 and says that he's basing his presentation of Theophilus on a historical description of the birth and growth of the Christian movement. He says that other people have written it out before, he's investigated carefully from the beginning, and he's drawn material from the eyewitnesses, and he's now putting the material together. And generally, if you look at Luke's world, his use of titles, his use of geography, he gets his world right. Places are where he says they are. He gets the titles of local officials right, sometimes for very, very precisely the period that he's writing about, because they often change in places from time to time. Let me give you an example or two. In chapter 13, verse 7, he has Cyprus, the island of Cyprus, as a proconsular province. And the proconsul is resident at Paphos, which is exactly what we know from our secular sources. When Paul's travelling overland in chapter 16, he goes first to Derbe and then to Lystra, which is the correct order of approach when you travel through the Cilician gates that pass through the mountains. In chapter 18, verse 12, he has Gallio as the proconsul of Achaia, the province that includes Corinth. Now we know from a letter to his brother that Gallio did this. Gallio's brother was a philosopher called Seneca. Achaia had a proconsul who was resident in Corinth from 27 BC to AD 15 and from AD 44 onwards. And it's in that second period that Paul's visit's located. So Luke gets it absolutely spot on for that period. In chapter 23, verse 2, Ananias is the high priest at the right time for what Luke's writing about. In 24:3, Luke has Paul addressing the Roman governor as Kratiste. The NRSV translates it, Your Excellency. The NIV has Most Excellent. And that's the correct form of address to a man who has equestrian rank. Or in chapter 28, verse 7, Malta has a protos, a first man. Not a proconsul, a first man. And we know that title from inscriptions from the period. So there's a number of examples of Luke getting his world right. How about synchronizing Acts with history? Well, in Acts, there are probably 5 dates that we can synchronize with data that we know from elsewhere. The first is the death of Herod Agrippa in chapter 12, verse 23. The Jewish writer Josephus speaks in his Antiquities of the death of Agrippa. In fact, he says quite a lot about Agrippa. He says that Agrippa became the tetrarch after Philip, and that happened shortly after the death of Tiberius and the accession of Caligula, which was on the 16th of March, AD 37. Josephus goes on to say that Agrippa succeeded to Antipas's tetrarchy after he'd reigned as tetrarch for 3 years over Philip's area. So we're now in about AD 40. He goes on to say that he was confirmed as the ruler of those territories and then given Judea, Samaria and Abilene on the accession of Claudius as emperor, which is in January AD 41. Josephus finally tells us that Agrippa died at a festival in Caesarea after 3 years as the king of Judea. In other words, during his 4th year as king and during his 7th year of reigning in total at the age of 53. So Josephus tells us that Agrippa died in about 44, probably before May, if we assume that he became king originally in 37 in May. We've got a letter from Claudius to the Jews that Josephus quotes, and he dates it in the 5th year when Claudius was a tribune, which is AD 45. And that letter's a reply to a complaint about removing the high priestly vestments after the death of Herod Agrippa I. So by AD 45, Agrippa's dead. So that helps us because it helps us nail the date of Agrippa's death to about AD 44. Second important date is in Acts 11:28. A prophet called Agabus prophesies that there will be a famine in Judea, and Luke records that this happened under Claudius, when Claudius was emperor. Now Josephus also writes about this famine. It seems to have happened when Tiberius Alexander was procurator over Palestine. Tiberius was succeeded by a man called Ventidius Cumanus. And we know that Cumanus was procurator in AD 48. That implies that Tiberius Alexander was procurator before him in 46 or 7. The famine looks to happen early in the procuratorship, so that famine looks to have happened in AD 46. Now just notice that that means that this event in Acts 11, which is prophesied, happens after the event in Acts 12. The prophecy is given in Acts 11, Herod dies, and then the prophecy is fulfilled a little bit later. Then there's the Edict of Claudius in Acts 18:2. Paulus Orosius was a 4th century Christian writer. He was a disciple of Augustine. And he mentions the Claudius Edict. Claudius's edict kicked all the Jews out of Rome. And Orosius says that Josephus is his authority for this, and says that because of Josephus, he knows that it happened in the 9th year of Claudius, which would be AD 49. Now, we haven't got the bit of Josephus that says this. This often happens in the ancient world, that somebody says, so-and-so says this, and we don't have the text from so-and-so that says it. But that is a really good fit with these other dates we've got. So it looks as though the Jews were kicked out of Rome in about AD 49. Gallio's proconsulate is the next thing in chapter 18, verse 12. We know that someone was only proconsul for 12 months. They started on July the 1st and they finished on the 30th of June the following year. There's an inscription from Delphi which quotes a letter from Claudius to Gallio making him proconsul. And it mentions that Claudius has been acclaimed emperor for the 26th time. Emperors periodically were acclaimed as emperor, maybe because they'd done something really good, maybe because one of their generals had won a battle, or maybe they just felt like putting themselves in front of the public again. So they get one of their friends to say, let's have a proclamation of so-and-so as emperor. And Claudius has been acclaimed emperor for the 26th time. Now we know from another inscription that the 27th acclamation occurred before the 1st of August 52. We know the 22nd, 23rd and 24th acclamations occurred between January the 25th, 51 and the 24th of January 52, because we've got another inscription linking those acclamations with Claudius's 11th year. So we can narrow the time frame down really dramatically. Somewhere between the 25th of January 51 and the 1st of August 52, this letter from Claudius to Gallio was written. That was when Gallio was proconsul in Achaia. Now, that most people therefore say Gallio probably became proconsul on the 1st of August 51 and retired from being proconsul on the 30th of July 52. Paul was in Corinth for about 18 months, according to Acts 18. It was when Gallio became proconsul that the Jews raised the problem with Paul in Acts 18:12. So that suggests that Paul arrived in Corinth in autumn AD 50 and he left in the spring of AD 52. That date is probably the most secure date in the whole of the New Testament. And New Testament scholars from right around the debate will work around that date as a core date. That's our fourth date. The fifth date we can be reasonably confident of is when Festus was procurator of Judea in chapter 24, verse 27. Felix was Festus's predecessor, and Luke tells us that, and so do Josephus and the Roman historian Tacitus and the Christian historian Eusebius. The Emperor Nero sent Festus in order to replace Felix. And a man called Pallas prevented Felix being punished. But he was dismissed by Nero in AD 55, his first year as emperor. The likelihood is that the information Tacitus gives us is really helpful, so that at this point, it's in the fourth year of the time that Nero is emperor, AD 59, that Festus is procurator. Now, from those 5 dates, we can then assemble, by working backwards and forwards, a pretty clear chronology of how the book of Acts fits together. And that's a chronology into which we can then start to fit other pieces of information from the letters of Paul and put those together.
This multimedia interactive video timeline explores the New Testament and Christian origins with key texts, figures and events clearly placed within their historical context. Many of these are then introduced and surveyed by scholars with expertise in that particular area. By selecting a highlighted text, a menu of illustrated video commentary appears, including maps, references, and on-location pictures and footage. All of this then adds up to a multimedia, interactive, scholarly yet accessible introduction to New Testament faith and thought in its historical context.